There are places on Earth people pass through without thinking. Places where trails are marked, rivers behave, and the woods feel like woods. Glastenbury Mountain is not one of those places. Many Vermonters refuse to hike it. Others won't speak its name after dark. And a quiet few, the oldest, the ones whose families live closest to the tree line, will only describe it with a single phrase whispered like a warning. That mountain takes what it wants. Glastenbury rises from the Green Mountain Range like a sleeping animal, old, patient, and heavy. Its slopes, covered in dense spruce and ancient birch, swallow daylight by mid-afternoon. Fog clings to its shoulders even on warm days, and the winds at its summit whistle in strange, uneven tones, as though playing through a broken instrument long before hikers disappeared, long before the newspapers named the region the Bennington Triangle. The native Abenaki refused to hunt or camp on that mountain. They believed the land was wrong, twisted, cursed, inhabited by a presence that shifted the forest itself. Their stories called it the place where the wind goes silent, a beautiful name until you hear the meaning. A place where nature forgets its own rules. The Abenaki described strange stones that hummed at dusk, ghostly shapes crossing the tree line, and something larger, something they never named, that supposedly stalked the ridges. The stories were so consistent that even European settlers in the 1700s documented odd lights and moving shadows in the woods. They built only a few rough cabins on the lower slopes and refused to go higher. Farming attempts failed. Tools went missing. Livestock bolted into the trees and vanished. Eventually, the settlers abandoned the idea entirely and chose the valleys instead. Yet, as generations passed, memory softened. People forgot the warnings. By the late 1800s, Glastenbury was busy with life. Loggers, sawmills, a railway line that crept along the mountainside like a steel scar. For a while, it thrived. But the forest swallowed that too. Logging companies collapsed. The land refused to be tamed, as if the mountain simply spat civilization back out. By 1898, the last mill shut down. Families fled, houses emptied. Instead of becoming a bustling mountain community, Glastenbury became a ghost town, reclaimed by the wood's rain-warped roofs. Moss grew over stone chimneys. Trails that once echoed with saws and boots faded into tangled brush. Even the railway rotted away one stolen spike at a time, leaving nothing but rust and memory. For decades afterward, Glastenbury Mountain remained a quiet, abandoned place. That kind of wilderness, untouched, unsupervised, should have been peaceful, but the people who lived near the town line insisted that the mountain was restless. Hunters spoke of deer carcasses arranged in unnatural patterns. Local boys dared each other to spend an hour in the forest, alone, and often returned pale and silent, unable to explain why they ran so fast. There were whispers of strange lights flickering behind the treetops. Some said the hum of the old sawmill still echoed at night, even though they had been gone for 40 years. Others swore they heard voices deep in the fog, voices that mimicked loved ones, calling from impossible distances. Still, life went on. Vermont grew, roads improved. New generations forgot the stories, shrugging off the legends as harmless folklore meant to scare children indoors before sunset, until 1945. That was the year Glastenbury began taking people again. The first to go missing was Middy Rivers, an experienced woodsman and hunter. His disappearance would soon be overshadowed by others even stranger. But it was the moment the region's old reputation awakened, like something remembering its hunger. Rivers vanished without a trace while leading a group of hunters. One moment ahead of them on a clear trail, the next moment gone as though the forest swallowed him whole. A year later, a college student named Paula Jean Weldon walked into the same wilderness wearing a bright red coat that should have been impossible to lose in the snow-darkened woods. Search teams combed every ridge and riverbank. Thousands of people, bloodhounds, planes, and not a single piece of evidence. No shoe, no fabric, no body, nothing. It was as though the land had opened a seam and let her fall through. And then it kept happening. A man disappeared from a moving bus. An 8-year-old boy vanished behind his family's farm. A woman fell out of sight for only a moment, and that was enough. By 1950, the disappearances had become so many, so strange, and so impossible to explain that the region was christened the Bennington Triangle, an American echo of the Bermuda Triangle legends, a place where logic breaks down and people simply stop existing. But long before the disappearances, long before the headlines, Glastenbury Mountain was already infamous. It was the quiet, unsettling details. The wind that stopped without warning, the forest that muffled footsteps, the trails that shifted after storms as though rearranged, that fed the mountain's mythology locals didn't speak in terms of ghosts or monsters. Instead, they used softer words: odd, off, wrong, as though the land itself contained a predator too ancient and patient to be seen. Some hikers claimed the woods felt deeper than they should be, as if the mountain stretched itself when no one was looking. Others described losing time on the trails, walking for what felt like 10 minutes, only to find an hour had passed. A few swore the trees moved slightly when watched from the corner of the eye, never when looked at directly. And then there were the sounds. The chirping of birds would suddenly fall silent. The insects stopped buzzing. The wind died completely, leaving the world mute. Hunters called these moments the Glastenbury quiet, a suffocating stillness that made even experienced men freeze in place. Something about it felt wrong in the bones, as though the forests were listening. Despite its growing reputation, hikers in the 1940s found the mountain beautiful. Deep green valleys, icy brooks, and trails lined with moss that glowed emerald after rain. It was the kind of wilderness that looked untouched by time. But that untouched quality was exactly what unsettled people who camped there overnight. They reported hearing clicking sounds in the trees, rhythmic, too regular to be natural. Others heard footsteps circling their tents, slow and deliberate, stopping whenever someone grabbed a flashlight. But the strangest detail repeated through decades of stories was this: compasses never worked properly on Glastenbury Mountain. Needles wobbled, spun, drifted off true north. Some blamed iron deposits. Others blamed faulty manufacturing. But locals blamed the mountain. As news of the disappearances spread through the late 1940s, journalists tried to rationalize the events they wrote about: rugged terrain, wild animals, disorientation, hypothermia, all the usual threats of the wilderness. But none of those explanations accounted for tracks that ended abruptly, for bodies never recovered, or for the simple fact that 5 people vanished in broad daylight within a 5-year span, all inside the same region. It was too many. Too close together, too perfectly unexplainable. Today, hikers still go missing in Vermont, but the cluster around Glastenbury remains unmatched. The forest has grown thicker around the ruins of the old town, and the trails have become narrower, more isolated. Even now, those who hike the mountain swear the silence there feels heavier than normal. Some return unsettled, as though watched others never return at all. And so, the legend remains. Glastenbury Mountain eats people. Not quickly, not loudly, but patiently, silently, Almost respectfully, it offers no answers, no evidence, and no remorse. By the time the world learned the name Bennington Triangle, the mountain had already taken its victims. But the story truly begins in 1945, on a clear, crisp November morning, when a seasoned outdoorsman stepped ahead of his hunting party and disappeared from the world as though he had never walked upon it at all. By the time November settled over the Bennington woods in 1945, the hunting season was in full swing. The war had ended only months earlier, and life in Vermont had a calm, grateful stillness to it. The mornings were crisp, the trees nearly bare, and the mountain air carried the faint scent of pine and cold stone. For many locals, this was the best time of year to head into the forest, and no one knew these woods better than Middy Rivers. At 74 years old, Middy wasn't just experienced. He was a legend, a lifelong outdoorsman. He moved through the wilderness with the quiet ease of someone who had spent more time in nature than among people. He could track deer across frozen ground, navigate mile-long trails blindfolded, and identify changes in weather by the smell of the wind. Everyone trusted him. Everyone followed him. And when the annual hunting trip began that November, the group had only one question for the seasoned woodsman. "Rivers, you leading us this year?" He always was. The group consisted of 4 local hunters, all younger than Middy, all experienced enough, but none with his sharp instincts. They began their trek up the mountainside, heading toward Hell Hollow, a rugged, heavily forested area that was quiet even by Glastenbury standards. Rivers walked ahead, moving at a brisk pace, occasionally stopping to point out tracks or signs of deer. The other men followed close behind, laughing, talking, unaware that they were walking into history, into the first chapter of what would become one of America's strangest clusters of disappearances. As the party made their way down the trail in the afternoon, Middy stayed several steps ahead, his orange hunting vest easily visible against the skeletal trees. The forest was familiar, the trail well worn. No one was worried. No one felt the strange heaviness that would later become synonymous with the Bennington Triangle. But then, Middy rounded a bend, and when the men followed, he was gone. At first, they weren't surprised. Rivers often walked ahead, scouting the path. They called his name casually, expecting to hear his voice echo back. When he didn't answer, they assumed he had gone slightly off trail to examine something 5 minutes past, then 10. The forest remained silent. A subtle uneasiness crept into the group. They began searching the immediate area. The trail was narrow, bordered by thick undergrowth, but not so dense that someone could vanish instantly. The ground showed no footprints leaving the path, no scuffed soil, no broken branches, nothing to indicate a struggle or sudden movement. It was as if the earth had refused to record his passing. As the afternoon deepened into evening, concern turned into alarm. The men split up, calling his name louder, sweeping the woods in expanding circles. Still nothing. Middy was too skilled, too knowledgeable to simply get lost. He knew every stream, every slope, every landmark. This was his home. Yet he had disappeared within it. When night fell, the hunting party hurried back to town and raised the alarm. The next morning, dozens of volunteers joined the search, then hundreds. Over the next several days, the search grew to include US Army soldiers, state police, professional trackers, bloodhounds, local woodsmen. They scoured miles of forest. They checked riverbanks, ravines, logging roads, abandoned cabins, and even the old Glastenbury Railroad bed helicopters buzzed overhead. Searchers carried lanterns at night. The sound of shouting echoed through the woods from sunrise until sunset. Nothing. Not a coat, not a gun, not a footprint, not a body. The strangest detail was the bloodhounds. They picked up Middy's scent easily. Of course they did. He had walked ahead of the group for hours, but just a short distance past the bend where he was last seen, the scent trail stopped, dead, as if he had simply walked off the planet. Some searchers whispered he must have fallen into a hidden crevice or mine shaft, but none were found in that area. Others suggested he had collapsed from a heart attack and been dragged away by animals, but experienced hunters dismissed that theory. There would have been signs, clothing, tracks, disturbance in the foliage, something. There was nothing. For the people of Bennington and the surrounding towns, Middy River's disappearance was impossible to comprehend. He wasn't reckless. He wasn't sick. He wasn't unfamiliar with the land. If anything, he was the one man everyone believed could survive in that wilderness, no matter what. And yet, he vanished more completely than any novice wanderer could. When the official search finally ended weeks later, locals accepted something quietly, without saying it aloud. The mountain had taken him. And if Glastenbury could swallow a man like Middy Rivers, the safest guide, the most experienced woodsman, then no one was safe on those trails. Still, no one imagined this would be only the beginning. One disappearance, no matter how strange, could be chalked up to chance. But a year later, when a young woman named Paula Jean Weldon set off on a simple hike wearing a bright red coat and never came back, the region's old legends stirred again. The mountain, it seemed, wasn't done, not even close. On the afternoon of December 1st, 1946, the air over Bennington College was as sharp as broken glass. Winter had arrived early that year, frosting the hills and sending thin trails of smoke curling from chimneys across the campus. Students hurried between buildings wrapped in scarves and wool coats, but one student moved with unusual ease, almost as if the cold energized her. Her name was Paula Jean Weldon, an 18-year-old sophomore with bright eyes, quiet confidence, and a curious, restless spirit. She studied art, dreamed of travel, and loved hiking more than anything else. Friends described her as thoughtful but adventurous, someone who found peace in the woods when life felt overwhelming. That Sunday, Paula was restless. She skipped dinner, changed into her red coat, a vibrant scarlet that would stand out in any forest, and told her roommate she was going for a walk. She didn't say where. She didn't take money. She didn't take extra clothes. She didn't even grab gloves. Just her coat, her boots, and a quiet desire to breathe cold air somewhere beyond the lights of campus. She hitchhiked toward the mountains, a common and safe practice in the area at the time. Several witnesses later confirmed seeing her smiling politely as she stepped out near the entrance to the long trail, one of Vermont's most well-known hiking paths, and then she began to walk. The trail was lightly dusted with snow, enough to crackle beneath her boots, but not enough to obscure the path. She was seen by at least 8 people during her ascent. A couple walking their dog, a man cutting firewood, a group of hikers heading down, a pair of farmhands driving by. Every witness described her as calm, unhurried, and alert. Nothing seemed wrong. Nothing hinted at danger. One of the final confirmed sightings came from a man named Frederick Bowerman, who saw Paula walking a few yards ahead of him. She turned a corner on the trail, still wearing her bright red coat. But when Bowerman reached the same curve, she was gone. At first, he assumed she had stepped off the trail briefly to rest or explore. The woods were quiet. the wind barely stirring. He kept walking, expecting to catch sight of that unmistakable flash of red. But he never did. Paula Weldon had stepped around a bend in a hiking trail, a simple, ordinary action, and vanished from the world. When she didn't return to her dorm that night, her roommate wasn't worried Paula had taken long walks before. But by morning, her empty bed, perfectly made untouched, sparked concern. Friends searched campus. Professors asked around. By that afternoon, panic had spread. For the next several days, Bennington College transformed into the nerve center of the most intense missing persons search Vermont had ever seen. Police combed the long trail. Students organized search parties. Locals packed lanterns and food, joining the hunt. Some sections of the forest were checked 3 or 4 times, but the most eerie detail emerged quickly. There were no footprints, no shoe impressions, no drag marks, no signs of struggle in the snow. Nothing. It was as if the bright red coat had never entered the woods at all. Search dogs picked up a faint trail near the first mile of the hike, then abruptly lost it, just like with Midi Rivers. It ended without reason, without transition, without direction. One moment the dogs followed confidently. The next, they circled in confusion and whined. Rumors began to spread. Some said Paula had run away, but she left no clothes, no letters, no money, no personal items missing from her room. Others whispered she had fallen into a ravine, but searchers covered every gully and slope multiple times. A few insisted she'd been abducted. But how, on a public trail full of witnesses? The forest offered none of its secrets. The longer she remained missing, the stranger the case became. One man claimed Paula had been seen in a nearby town days later. This was disproven. Another insisted she'd been murdered by someone she knew. No evidence supported it. A third person confessed outright to killing her. But his story fell apart instantly under questioning. The truth was simpler and far more terrifying. Paula had disappeared in broad daylight, within sight of other people, on a trail so open a red coat should have been visible from half a mile away. Her father, Archibald Weldon, arrived in Vermont devastated. He hired private detectives. He searched abandoned cabins. He walked sections of the long trail himself, calling his daughter's name until his voice faltered. Nothing. His grief turned into fury at the disorganized handling of the case. At that time, Vermont had no statewide police force. Local departments were small and uncoordinated leads were lost. Timelines were confused. Evidence was mishandled or never collected at all. The failure was so severe that Paula's disappearance directly led to the creation of the Vermont State Police the following year. But for Paula, it was too late. She had become another name swallowed by the mountain. Winter deepened. Snow erased any hope of fresh evidence, and the long trail became a place of whispered dread. First, Midi Rivers, now Paula Jean Weldon. 2 disappearances in 1 year, 2 trails that ended in nothing, 2 cases with no explanations. Locals began to remember the old legends, the quiet parts of the forest, the wind that died without warning, the sense of being watched. And as 1947 arrived, whispers grew into fear, because the mountain had taken 2, and rumors said it was never satisfied with 2. By 1949, the disappearances of Midi Rivers and Paula Jean Weldon had already settled over Bennington, like a fog no wind could lift. People locked their doors earlier, hikers avoided the mountain, and those who lived near the woods said the nights felt different, heavier, quieter, as if the land itself were listening. But whatever haunted Glastenbury Mountain was far from done. Over the next 2 years, 3 more people vanished under circumstances even stranger than the first 2. Each disappearance was unique, but something connected them. Something unseen, unspoken, and impossible to ignore. It was as if the mountain was tightening its grip, pulling people in more boldly and more brazenly. 1. James E. Tetford, the man who vanished from a moving bus, 1949. The story begins with James Tetford, a 68-year-old veteran living at the Bennington Soldiers' Home. On December 1st, 1949. Exactly 3 years to the day after Paula disappeared. Tetford boarded a bus in St. Albans, heading back toward Bennington. He was last seen alive by 14 passengers, the bus driver, and several people who rode with him. He sat near the back, reading a pamphlet, his suitcase tucked at his feet. The bus made several stops along the way. Each time, witnesses said Tetford was still there, sitting calmly, staring out the window as pine trees and snowy hills drifted past. But when the bus pulled into Bennington, James Tetford was gone. His seat was empty. His suitcase was still in place. His identification papers, bus schedule, and personal belongings were exactly where he left them. There were no stops where he could have slipped away unnoticed. No evidence he got off early. No sign of struggle. No open windows, no explanation. It was as if he simply dissolved into thin air sometime between the second to last stop and Bennington. A vanishing from a forest trail was one thing, but disappearing from a moving bus surrounded by witnesses pushed the case into the realm of the unreal. Sheriff's deputies searched the route on foot, checking every ditch, ravine, and field. Nothing. Tetford had evaporated from a sealed space. People began whispering that the mountain didn't need you to enter its forest anymore. It could reach out and take you wherever you were. 2. Paul Jepson, the boy in the red jacket, 1950. 10 months later, the Triangle claimed someone even more defenseless. An 8-year-old boy named Paul Jepson. On October 12, 1950, Paul accompanied his mother to the town dump, where she worked as a caretaker. While she tended to the animals, Paul played just a few yards away, close enough that a parent could see a child at all times. But for a few moments, his mother looked away. When she turned back, Paul was gone. She called for him, expecting him to emerge from behind a shed or barrel. But the silence that followed was too familiar, too chilling. The same silence that had haunted the trails of Glastenbury. Since the first disappearance, search parties arrived within hours. For once, there was a possible clue. Paul had been wearing a bright red jacket, the same color Paula Weldon wore. Searchers believed it would be easy to spot. They were wrong. Bloodhounds picked up Paul's scent and followed it eagerly, straight toward Glastenbury Mountain. Then, at a forest road cutting through the lower slope, the trail stopped cold. Not faded, not weakened. Stopped. Searchers suggested Paul may have been abducted. Others thought he wandered deeper into the forest. But why would a child walk uphill into thick, unforgiving terrain when home was in the opposite direction? A small boy, wearing a red jacket, had vanished into the same pattern as the others. A trail that suddenly ended, no footprints, no clues, no explanation. Paul's father later confessed he believed the mountain had taken his son. He didn't say it metaphorically, he meant it. 3. Frida Langer, the woman who should have been found, 1950. The final disappearance came only 16 days after Paul's. On October 28, 1950, Frida Langer, a 53-year-old experienced hiker, went camping with her husband and cousin near the Somerset Reservoir, close to the base of Glastenbury Mountain. Frida knew the woods. She'd hiked them hundreds of times, But that afternoon, while walking a short trail near the campsite, she slipped and fell into a shallow stream, soaking her clothes. Laughing it off, she told the men she'd run back and change. She was less than 100 yards from camp, a straight, wide, familiar path, visible almost the entire way. She never returned. Her husband and cousins sprinted down the trail within minutes. They expected to find her changing clothes. Instead, they found nothing. No footprints, no disturbed soil, no broken branches. The woods were silent, crushingly so search teams responded immediately. This time, the search was enormous. Hundreds of volunteers, helicopters, dogs, police, forest rangers. They combed every inch of ground between the campsite and the reservoir, and for the first time in the entire 5-year timeline, something changed. 6 months later, Frida Langer's body was found. It was lying in an open clearing near the reservoir, an area that had been thoroughly searched multiple times. Search teams insisted, with absolute certainty, that the body had not been there before. Even more disturbing, Frida's remains were too decomposed to identify a cause of death, despite the fact that the freezing climate should have preserved them far better. The body's sudden appearance in a previously searched area only deepened the mystery. Some believed animals had dragged her there, but experts dismissed it. The body was intact. Others said she must have died somewhere else and been placed there. But by who and why? The pattern had become undeniable. Midi Rivers, vanished Paula Weldon, vanished James Tedford, vanished Paul Jepson, vanished Frida Langer, reappeared in a place she shouldn't be. 5 people, 5 impossible disappearances, 1 mountain. And as the last search party left the woods in the spring of 1951, the Bennington Triangle legend was solidified. Whatever haunted the mountain had taken what it wanted. But the strangest part of all, it stopped. No more disappearances, no more vanishings. As if, after 5 victims, something on Glastenbury Mountain went dormant again. By 1951, 5 disappearances in just under 5 years had carved the legend of the Bennington Triangle into stone. The mountain stood silent, as it always had, ancient, indifferent, cold. But the people living around it were left wrestling with a terrifying question. What exactly was happening on Glastenbury Mountain? Was it nature, a killer, something supernatural, or something humanity doesn't yet understand? Investigators, historians, and locals have tried for decades to make sense of the disappearances, but none of the explanations ever quite fit, because every theory answers one part of the mystery, while leaving another piece completely unsolved. Here are the theories, the logical, the strange, and the ones whispered only in the dark. 1. Human predator. The silent stalker. Theory. The simplest explanation. Someone was hunting people. A serial killer operating in the forest could explain the vanishings, except for one massive problem. Serial killers are predictable methods repeat. Victims fit patterns, evidence accumulates. But the Bennington cases, one was a child, one was an elderly man, one disappeared from a bus, one left a trail that evaporated, one reappeared in a place that was already searched. A single killer couldn't be in all those places at once, using entirely different methods, without ever leaving a trace. Yet some locals swear the disappearances were too clean, too quick, too deliberate. Some believe a hunter, possibly living off-grid in the mountain, stalked hikers and travelers, taking advantage of the wilderness. But the truth is harsh. No evidence of a killer was ever found. Not a footprint, not a shred of clothing, not one confirmed sighting. If a human was responsible, they were perfect, too perfect. 2. The mountain itself, a dead zone of nature. Scientists have pointed to Glastenbury Mountain's geography. It lies on a massive foundation of quartz and magnetic rock. Some believe the area could interfere with compasses, radios, and even the human brain. Strange natural explanations include infrasound low-frequency vibrations caused by wind passing over the mountain can induce panic, dizziness, disorientation, a sense of being watched, irrational flight behavior. Some believe the victims simply wandered off in a confused state and succumbed to the elements. But that doesn't explain Tetford disappearing from a bus Langer, reappearing in a searched area. The boy's scent stopping abruptly on a road. Nature explains some things, never all three. Portals, gateways, and windows into the unknown locals have whispered this theory for generations. There's a place on that mountain where people don't come back from, not a cave, not a pit, not a river. A place. A natural window, a tear in reality, where people step through without realizing it. These disappearances feel different from ordinary lost person cases. They're too sudden, too clean, too impossible. Some believe the mountain has thin spots, places where directions don't behave normally. Sound travels strangely, distance feels warped, time itself seems thicker or slower. Hikers have reported sudden silence, as if sound is sucked away, feeling watched despite being alone. A sensation of walking in circles, even on straight paths, seeing shadows move between trees. This theory, though unprovable, is eerily consistent with the victim's last known moments. Paula Weldon walked into the woods and vanished mid-trail. Paul Jepson's scent ended abruptly, as if lifted into the air. Frida Langer disappeared on a straight path. She had walked hundreds of times. People don't just evaporate, unless the place allows for it. 4. The Bennington Curse, a very old legend. Long before the disappearances, Native American tribes refused to settle near Glastenbury Mountain. Not avoided, not disliked, refused. They believed the land was cursed, a place where the four winds fought each other, a place where the forest didn't belong to humans. They called it the home of a man-eating stone, a stone that opened and swallowed people whole. Folklore? Maybe, but chillingly similar to the idea of people vanishing without a trace. No struggle, no remains, no clues, just taken. 5. The most haunting theory of all, something we don't have a name for, not supernatural, not human, not natural, something else, something the mountain has always held, something ancient, unseen, and uninterested in us, except occasionally, unpredictably. The disappearances happen in cycles, a restless period, a cluster of vanishings, a long silence like a creature feeding or sleeping. For nearly 70 years since Frida Langer's death, Glastenbury Mountain has been quiet, too quiet, as if whatever was responsible is only waiting, resting, digesting, and when the cycle begins again, when the mountain wakes up, no one will see it coming, just like the last 5.